So hi to everyone that's joined or will be joining. Um, as I'm sure you know, this is Bright Garden Voices, and I'll be filling in as a guest host for this very special garden chat. My name is Marat. I was born in Baku in 1989 to a mixed Armenian Azerbaijani couple. That's about it in terms of my field work in the Caucasus, but some of you may know me already. Probably more of you know who I'll be speaking with, and I'm talking about Thomas de Waal. De Waal is a British journalist and scholar specializing in Eastern Europe and the Caucasus. He's familiar to many of us as the author of the 2003 book, Black Garden. It's probably the most widely known published work on the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. Thomas, thanks for coming on with me.
Great, great to be here. Sorry about all the delays, and for those, particularly those of you in the middle of the night on the West Coast.
That's all right. I wasn't gonna sleep for this anyway. Since this is our first time chatting, I'm sure you've told the story many times, but I haven't heard it. So could you just tell me about how you got started in the Caucasus and what kind of sparked that interest?
Sure. Well, it's quite a long story. How long do we have? I trained in Russian as a Russianist, Russian language and literature. First came to the Soviet Union in the 1980s as a student. Was always fascinated by the South. It was still one country, obviously. Went down to spent my first visit to the Soviet Union. I did a language course in Pyatigorsk in the North Caucasus. Made a trip to Tbilisi. I was pretty much hooked from that point. I went to Armenia as a student in 1986. I came back in the 1990s. Obviously, Soviet Union had fallen apart as a journalist. I was covering both the North and the South Caucasus, a time of complete tumult and change and conflict. Covered the war in Chechnya, so for many years that was my focus in the 1990s was Chechnya. But I was always fascinated by Karabakh. I went to Azerbaijan in 1995. I went to Yerevan and Armenia in 1996. Yerevan and Karabakh in 1996. And I wanted to kind of read the book about the Karabakh conflict because I was getting so totally different sides of this story. And there was no book. There was just a couple of kind of Armenian texts that told you what happened in kind of 500 AD. And then there was also Thomas Goltz was writing his book about Azerbaijan, which was a great read, but that was obviously all from the Azerbaijani side. I got to know Goltz. But eventually I decided I was going to, as it were, write the book that I wanted to read as no one else, as there wasn't that book. I wanted to kind of tell the story of what happened. And that I did in the year 2000, which is where I spent most of that year going back and forth between Azerbaijan, Armenia, Karabakh. And I think I was quite lucky in the timing. The war was over, but people's memories were still pretty fresh. And Azerbaijan was still a little bit more, it was more open than it is now. So people were willing to talk. And I just went out and sought out people, big and small, presidents and, villagers and just refugees, and just wanted them to tell their story, and that was the book. And then I also spent a lot of time in Moscow trying to figure out what had happened there in this period, and got some very good interviews there. So that's basically the story of the book that became Black Garden.
Thank you. And you kind of touched on what my next question was going to be, which was the process of writing Black Garden, or why you wanted to. But also I wanted to ask if you had a strategy on how to best appear objective and neutral as you're writing it, because obviously you'd have that responsibility.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think as a writer and a journalist, obviously you have a responsibility, and obviously you're relying on oral histories and sources, which is obviously imperfect. So you want, for every story you want to get kind of someone else who was near that room or near that event and get their version, and it's not perfect, but there's very few written sources on this conflict, and I'm not sure if we got the written sources exactly how good they would be anyway on a battle or a refugee flight or whatever. So it is about a bit of journalism and a bit of written sources. Clearly, I'm and this is this issue of being called both sideists or whatever that's supposed to mean. You're just trying to get as many angles on the story as you can, and obviously maybe that's all sideists. But then clearly, if people are getting killed, you're not blaming the victim in that particular instance. You're telling it how it is. And so I don't. It's just kind of what you do as a writer in a situation like that, and the reader can respond as he or she wants.
Okay, and do you feel Black Garden has played a role in shaping any impactful narratives surrounding the conflict, or have you ever felt or seen some of its impact yourself from the book? I mean.
Yeah, for sure. And I think there's two interesting stories there. One is obviously I wrote it in English, mainly, as I said, as a kind of for internationals to understand what this happened in this conflict, trying to understand how it started, what happened, the role of Russia, all of those issues, and obviously to kind of give voice to some of the people in that conflict who I felt didn't have a voice. So that was every single negotiator or ambassador I think who's dealt with this conflict has read that book, and many of them have said they found it very helpful in their work. So that's one readership, one audience. I guess the other one is, which I didn't really anticipate at the time, was the locals in the region, people in the region, and then of course it got translated into Russian. It did actually get translated into Azeri and Armenian as well. I'm not quite sure how many people read those editions because they were quite small editions, but it certainly got translated into Russian. It's actually been translated into Turkish as well by the Hrant Dink Foundation, which I'm pleased about. I think, and then, I started to get people from the region telling me how helpful the book had been for them. Armenian journalists saying on one side they'd never had proper access to the other side. But then the most moving thing was just ordinary people who just said, you managed to, I'd grown up with this brainwashing, this propaganda, what I'd been taught in school, and you smashed it for me, or your book was the first step for me out of that kind of prison that my government had put on me about how I was supposed to view this conflict. And, every time I go to the region, always, pretty much every time, someone either stops me in the street or in a cafe and says, it's great to meet you, thank you, which is obviously really gratifying, even if it's just one person. There are people out there, and it's obviously a contrast to the kind of, what you see on Twitter, which I think is a bit of an artificial world of people battling out and still kind of posturing in large part. I think there are thoughtful people out there who want a different narrative. And I think the book really helped with that.
So I was actually curious about that, of how popular the book was in the Russian language world. I also probably guessed that maybe in the Armenian and Azerbaijani editions, the readership wasn't as high, but I was curious about Russian because most of the people that I know that know you or know your book are primarily in the West. For example, somebody like my dad. I'm not not saying anything, but like someone like my dad wouldn't be as familiar with you as someone of my generation and someone that grew up here in the West. So, what was like the readership like in the Russian language world?
I mean, it's very hard for me to judge. I know that people read it in Russia as well, obviously. I know that even someone at BBC even told me, I don't know for what it's worth, that Russian peacekeepers were given copies, but I mean, they probably didn't do much with it. But you know, clearly, I think in the region, people have read it, and it's very hard for me to judge because obviously there's an ocean of every day of a kind of narrative on both sides. I think, you know, in the Armenian narrative, there are more than one. There's probably more than one narrative in Azerbaijan as well. But you know, there's a lot out there which, you know, is demonstrably false and needs to be. You know, I mean, the stuff that's said about Sumgait, about Khojali, some of the historical stuff. It really is. You know, all you need is a little bit of curiosity to realize that it's false. But I think you know, Black Garden, I'm sure, has helped with that. And I guess the other thing is also giving human voices to the other side. You know, if you're, you know, unless you're kind of over 50, and you haven't met. You're unlikely to have met someone from the other side unless you know, you're a businessman in Georgia or something like that. So I think that's, you know, part of that book was also kind of giving voices to the voiceless. It was about letting people tell their stories, and hopefully that helped as well.
I agree. I think it's very important. When the war started, and you know, went on social media, I was a bit less cynical than I am now, and I thought that was equally important, was to give some counter narrative to what people were used to on Twitter. So I understand the importance of that, definitely. You know, coming into the Caucasus, you know, you mentioned that you had initially just traveled there and fell in love. So as you were writing this, did you feel like you were coming into this without a bias?
Well, I mean, I guess in a sense, because more have been written from the Armenian side, you know, this is obviously the difference between two peoples. Armenians are very textual people. Armenians will give you a book in about 5 minutes after they meet you, and Armenians will you say something, they will send you a link to a particular bit of text. You know, so clearly more has been written on the Armenian side. So I felt. And so maybe
Actually,
there was a bit of a bias.
Learn how to do that too now.
Well, sure, but we're talking about the 1990s.
Go ahead.
Yeah,
sorry.
we're talking about the 1990s, where there was very much, and so kind of I had to work a lot harder on the Azerbaijani side to get the stories out. You know, some of the facts were clearly wrong that people were telling me. You know, you still hear about 20% of territory, 1 million. IDPs, which is just clearly wrong. So you had to work a lot harder on the Azerbaijani side to get the stories out, which needed to be told. And there's been a kind of funny thing about that book. I mean, for one thing, I'm surprised that 20 years on, it's still being read. I guess now it's kind of a bit of a historical document, given everything that's happened. But it's kind of gone into... First of all, I would say it was more popular on the Azerbaijani side because no one had properly written their side of the story, and then suddenly I was filling in the, and then it became, and then the Azerbaijani propaganda machine really got going, and they didn't want, my book became a bit inconvenient on various points. It became a bit more popular on the Armenian side, and so back and forth until I think it's, you know. It kind of clearly there are people who read it who just read it, but I notice a kind of little waves. The same book, but kind of the political use of it has changed a bit on both sides. Of course, at the beginning of the book, I do say, please don't quote this book selectively. But of course, no one obeys that. You know, they you know, people that we all know or out there on Twitter, you know. The man who I also know, who's now Azerbaijani ambassador in Germany, very happy to kind of, screenshot a bit of my book to prove a point, and likewise on, et cetera, et cetera. But, obviously the whole book should stand and fall as one document. But, that's obviously a wish and a prayer.
Thank you. We'll switch gears here to we'll kind of step into a time machine. I want to get your perspective, but without the benefit of hindsight. We'll travel back in time to a couple different points, and I want to know what your thought process was on what will happen with Artsakh at these specific points. So I'll say in 2016, which was the 4-Day War, 2018, which of course is the Velvet Revolution, and 2020, which would be the war. So at those three different points, was there a big shift in what you thought was going to happen in the future, in the near future, or in the distant future?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, to be honest, I was a bit personally turning away from Karabakh after about 2016. I wanted to, I didn't want to. First of all, it's a bit of a burden to have written. I'm glad I wrote the book, but it's also a bit of a burden. How many books are there on Bosnia or on Chechnya? And I'm glad that Lawrence Burroughs wrote his excellent book. But clearly my book is out there. It's not perfect, but people kept on referring to it as the text, which is, I guess, not very healthy. So I was trying to do other things. And maybe I wasn't paying much attention already to Karabakh in 2020. It caught me a bit by surprise, and obviously I got dragged back into it. For me, I think a key moment was 2016, which should have been the wake-up call to everyone in the world that this conflict, is liable to go back into a new war. And then you got this high-level meeting in Vienna. John Kerry was there, Lavrov was there. I think someone very senior from the EU was there, maybe it was Mogherini. And the two sides committed to some stuff. And then within a few months, they were just kind of tearing it up again. And suddenly it was kind of like nothing had happened. And for me, that was kind of really dangerous. It was a sign that it wasn't an international priority, and that something bad like this could happen again, and we weren't quite sure on what level. Let me just say one other thing. There was back in, I'm trying to remember the year, it may have been something like 2009, 2010, I wrote a piece called The Karabakh Trap. It was all about how everything in this conflict was short-termist. Everyone was thinking in the short term, but there was a long-term trajectory which was quite dangerous. And I was making the point there that, and I've made that point even more strongly in a piece I wrote in 2016. It's called Prisoners of the Caucasus, is what's needed to resolve this conflict is international security guarantees. That means that you have some troops on the ground, OSCE, UN, some kind of force. The Azerbaijanis can return to their territories. There's some, which means allows the Karabakhis and the Armenians to give up all that land. There's some kind of interim arrangement in Karabakh, some kind of international administration, some peacekeepers on the ground, and then that's how you begin to solve it. That, for me, was the conviction, for at least a decade. That was, for me, the only way this was ever going to get solved. I went to Karabakh, and I got a very hostile reaction to this. When I talked about peacekeepers, they said, "Oh no, look what happened to the UN in Srebrenica. We can only rely on ourselves. We can only rely on ourselves to defend ourselves." And you make the argument that's a very dangerous thing because you're basically inviting war. But for me, that's from that point, the internationals weren't going to be interested until there was a strong signal from the locals that this is what they want. Why if you're John Kerry, spend time on this conflict unless someone in Baku or Yerevan is seriously telling you that they're interested, and that there really wasn't that. And so that's the point for me when it was already kind of drifting into this is going to get settled on the battlefield, I'm afraid.
Interesting. Okay. So in regards to as the decade progresses, then, and when Nikos comes to power,
Right.
how did your thinking shift immediately on that in
Well,
that year?
Again, I wish I'd been following it more closely. As I said, I was doing other things. I was spending some time in Ukraine. It's a bit of a black humor here that to take a break from conflict, I was spending more time in Ukraine when we look at what's happening now. But yeah, no, I think there was, you're getting so many different signals out of Yerevan from that period that Nikol wants a different approach. But then there was this kind of feeling there was a kind of bit of an unprofessional attitude. There were some people around who understood, but it just looked like a bunch of 30 and 40-year-olds who'd taken power and by democratic means, and they wanted to kind of disrupt everything and start again. And of course, they ended up disrupting this very delicate diplomatic process as well. So yeah, it was they were kind of unfreezing the conflict, and it wasn't quite sure whether they were going to unfreeze it in a positive way or in a negative way. And unfortunately, as we saw what we saw.
Okay. And now, but following Nico, as you mentioned, and it's all right. It was a surprise for most of us, I think. But when 2020 came, it was a total shock for you, or?
Well, yeah. I mean, obviously, the strange thing is, I've been predicting war for so long. I've been trying to, for at least a decade. I'd written a piece about once a year saying, we've really got to pay. You internationals really got to pay attention to this Karabakh conflict. It's war could happen this year, and then when the moment happened, I was caught off guard. I hadn't expected it to happen at that moment. I guess, of course, remember we were all in the pandemic as well, and maybe our antennae weren't as good as they should have been because we were all in the pandemic. Clearly there have been some signals. The visit by Pashinyan to Shusha, this whole Artsakh project, which from 2017, which was incredibly dangerous because I've never used the word Artsakh because it implies Artsakh implies a kind of a land without Azerbaijanis there. It doesn't give them any perspective. So there have been a few signals, but I mean. Then I guess what you had to be watching, and it's very hard to watch, is both the Russians and the Turks. And clearly what happened in 2020 was that the Turks shifted their policy. I'd spent a lot of time in Ankara because I also wrote the book about Turkey and Armenia, so I'd spent a lot of time in Ankara. And the foreign ministry people were always, in favor of restraint, that we support Azerbaijan, but we don't support a war. So I'd missed the moment when that policy flipped, and obviously that policy came from the boss, from Erdogan. It didn't come from the top. And clearly that the Russian policy changed, that they wanted, they were frustrated with the Armenians, and they were ready or prepared for, I thought, in my view, they were ready for a small war. I thought they were probably ready for 2016 or a bit more than 2016, but I don't think the Russians anticipated the kind of success that Azerbaijan would have in 2020. I think they anticipated that this would be a kind of wake-up call for the Armenians. The Azerbaijanis were going to get territory back, and that the Russian Lavrov plan would be able to be affected, and the Russians would be inserted right in the middle of this conflict, which they were right at the end, but with almost total Azerbaijani victory at the end. And I guess he needed to be very close to people in Moscow and in Ankara to see those shifts coming.
Thank you. I appreciate the complete answers. We'll try to move along through these. I wanted to ask you about the what effects you think the information war has on this second phase of the conflict compared to the first war in the early 90s?
Yeah, I mean, I think, thank God there wasn't Twitter back then, because, you know, clearly when you were in the 90s and 2000s, you were moving around, you met a lot of ordinary people who had stories, who were very hostile to the other side. They had grievances, but you know, they would just shout them to the air or to their living room or to their spouse or whatever. And obviously, what you have now in the age of Twitter is people fighting. You know, they don't encounter an Armenian or Azerbaijani in person, but they can encounter them on social media, and they can hurl abuse, or they can troll, they can be sarcastic, and I think it's incredibly negative phenomenon. I really, and you know, I'm not even happy with my engagements on Twitter, on X. You know, I find it traumatic sometimes, just, you know, going in there and the abuse you get, or you try and you'll either say something too sharp and you get abuse, or you say something too bland and you're both sides. You know, you can't win, basically. So I think the information war and social media in particular, I don't follow other platforms in particular so much as Twitter has been incredibly negative. And if someone could just, there was a big red button and someone could switch social media off on this conflict and press it, I think that would be good for everybody.
Yeah, I think it's been horrible for polarization. You know, prior to this war, being here in the U.S., being half Azerbaijani, you know, other than like Hayastansis and Armenians, you know, my age or older, you know, oftentimes, like even just mentioning Baku was a total afterthought. So it's a shame that for Azerbaijanis or for Armenians, the first introduction to each other was on a platform like this. And even like kind of as you touched on the name game, right? I call it the name game, but like Artsakh, I find it interesting. You said for you it was dangerous. I personally say Artsakh. I'm not against saying Karabakh, you know, but like the stuff like that, I feel like has been heightened by
Right.
social media because of this importance
Right.
that either a narrative or a word or the use of a word plays for people, and once you're in that the digital reality, saying something is the same thing as doing it, right? And so,
can I say a couple of words on that? I mean,
sure.
I think, you know, when I first went to Karabakh in the 90s, I didn't hear the name Artsakh. I mean, I heard it from a couple of people, but you know, I think what I caught in that period was the end of something which was Karabakh, and it's something I really miss. And I think it was Karabakh is a kind of Eastern Armenian province, which is very different from Armenia. Has its own dialect. I don't speak Armenian, but like even I could tell that the language was different, the culture was different, a bit more Persianized, maybe a bit more Russianized. Certainly, you know, it's a different culture with this very old Armenian heritage, which you feel on the ground with those churches and graveyards and so on. And it was something called Karabakh, and then there was this kind of process of Artsakhization, particularly brought out from people in, I guess, in the diaspora as well, imposing their kind of new idea of this kind of little Armenian utopia and adopting and using this new old name. And I think for me that was a real shame. It became a bit of a playground of certain diaspora people at Karabakh. But I caught something which was a bit different, and that's something I'm mourning now, which is gone. I feel like kind of it's gone. Its people have gone, and obviously now we've got the process which we might call the Khankendi process, where all the Armenian names get given Azeri names, which have never been, you know, which are again totally artificial. And you've got this kind of, and you're going to get this kind of new, shiny, modern, authoritarian Azerbaijan, you know, imposed there. And for me, this is not this region. It's neither Artsakh and it's not Khankendi. It's Karabakh, and what we're seeing now, and I'm feeling really sad about in the last is the end of Karabakh.
hopefully we can circle back to this one. I do have more to say, but I want to move along here. So for in the past, you've expressed some confidence in international norms to protect your territorial
Yeah.
integrity. To quote you exactly, you had said what worked against Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh protect them in the Republic of Armenia. How do you feel today about that? And how strong is your faith in protecting the Republic's territorial integrity? And I'm of course hinting
Well, I
at
mean,
the possible looming danger for Sunik
yeah.
and other enclaves in Armenia.
Well, I mean, obviously, these are supposedly the kind of the framework of international law that everyone was, the international order is supposed to be based around. But clearly, international integrity is just one principle. And if you don't protect the rights of the people within your borders, then you invoke other principles like self-determination and human rights and protection of minorities. And for me, it's been used very cynically. I saw that in Chechnya in the 1990s, where the Russians got away with all sorts of horrendous stuff in the name of territorial integrity, and this is what Azerbaijan is doing. A place that was never part of independent Azerbaijan. It was a fairly arbitrary decision in 1921 which way it was going to go. Clearly, it went to Azerbaijan, and that's important. But you have Azerbaijan. That didn't give Azerbaijan carte blanche to do whatever it wanted with this territory. It needed to respect the rights of the people there, hopefully give them some kind of autonomy. So this is, so I feel that these international principles, unfortunately, in the South Caucasus, are just being abused more than they're used, and we certainly see that with the fact that President Aliyev is now raising this new discourse of Western Azerbaijan against Armenia, so therefore kind of implicitly threatening Armenia. And we also saw it, President Erdogan congratulating Aliyev on the liberation of Karabakh, and just a week before at the UN, he'd been calling for the recognition of Northern Cyprus. So everyone, instrumentalizes these terms, and I think they're important political terms, but they need to be put within a kind of bigger international framework. So that's a kind of a bit of a long answer to that question about why. For my mind, again, getting back to the point about there needed to be some kind of international presence on the ground, like there was in the Balkans, like there was in many, many other conflict zones, for any hope of this succeeding peacefully.
So, how would you, like, if you're an Armenian in Sunik, how do you feel? I know you tried to give a nuanced answer, but just like
sure. No, if you're an Armenian in Sunik, you feel threatened. Clearly, I think. To my mind, what we're seeing here is, this is dangerous and unpredictable. So I'm not going to be too complacent here. But I think there are some deterrents about Azerbaijan using force in Sunik. I think that would be the end of certain things. It would be probably the end of the gas deal with the European Union and quite a lot of things that Azerbaijan finds important. I think what we're seeing is coercion. What we've seen since the end of the 2020 war is Azerbaijan using both coercion and force. And I think what we're basically getting here is everything short of force. So Azerbaijan saying to the Armenians, you've got to accept this deal on the so-called Zangezur corridor. We're threatening to use force, but we're going to just do everything to menace you until you agree. And of course, they're helped by the fact they've got both the Russians and the Turks wanting the same deal.
Yeah, and that feeds into the next question, which was, what are Armenia's viable security options right now?
It's clearly the only troops on the ground are Russians, and they're probably more of a threat now to Armenian security than they are a viable protection. So that's a big problem. So yeah, Armenia's security options are basically based on international deterrence by the West, based on the principle of Armenians' territorial integrity. You know, so it's a difficult situation, but I think people in Washington, people in various European capitals now have a pretty good picture on this. They've seen Armenia kind of cede position after position. They've seen Azerbaijan cross over so many red lines in the last few years that I think people get it now in Western capitals.
I'll tell
Oops.
far less. Sorry, that was me. The mood is far less optimistic.
Sure.
Over on the Armenian side.
Sure.
In terms of
for sure.
How the West might react. Also, on the flip side, what do you think was Russia's agency in all of this? Like, were they greenlighting it, or are they just slowly in quicksand, and they're just poorly adapting to their own demise? Like, how much of this were they pulling the strings?
I think clearly, we don't see 95% of what Russia is up to in the Caucasus, and clearly and these two governments in Moscow and Baku, they know each other incredibly well. They've got very, very good links, much better links, obviously, than with Moscow and Yerevan, with this new young elite in Yerevan. They speak each other's language. So I think I think they knew what was going on. I think they knew that their position was a lot weaker. They knew that the relationship with Armenia was breaking down. They could no longer offer security guarantees to Armenia. Armenia is heading off in this new post-Russian, more pro-Western direction. So what do you do in this situation? You put pressure on the Armenian government. You look for regime change in Armenia, and you partner with Azerbaijan more strongly. But you partner on a more kind of equal footing. You're no longer calling the shots. You've got a kind of downgraded role, if you like, in the region. But Azerbaijan offers you various things. It's clearly Russia's main land and sea route to the south. It's to Turkey and Iran and to the Middle East. It's also a kind of bridge to Turkey. You're kind of trying to kind of build Russia, Azerbaijan, Turkey bridge. Now that your western frontier is pretty much closed. That's incredibly important. So I think that's what's going on. Russia downgraded, but still in the game, trying to pressure the Armenians, trying to kind of destabilize Armenia, and trying to partner with Azerbaijan on a kind of new, slightly more equal relationship, and therefore greenlighting this operation, standing the peacekeepers down in Karabakh and refusing to condemn the military operation in Karabakh.
Got it. I have like a hypothetical. We don't have to go too long on this, but let's say, because I've been thinking about this, let's say there's no Velvet Revolution, and because right now I'm thinking of if the previous regime in Armenia was still in power, there's still a world where I see that Russia gets caught up in the Ukraine war anyway, and has to figure out a way to, or not even has to figure out a way, but is so caught up in this that it ends up in the same consequences or in the same result that we're in now. What do you think about that? Like, maybe you kind of even answered this earlier when you saw that even in 2009, 2010, things were going downhill, but do you see that same hypothetical happening?
Yes and no. Yes and no. I think the previous regime in Armenia was much cleverer with the Russians. I think Serge Sarkisyan knew how to play the Russians and the West. He knew how to say the right things on the process with Azerbaijan. He was from Karabakh, but he would never have gone to Shusha and said Artsakh, Armenia, Artsakh is Armenia. He would never have done that. So he would, I think Russia would have, there would be more of a balancing policy, and more of a deterrent to Azerbaijan to launching the 2020 war, which doesn't mean that Azerbaijan would not have done it anyway. But I think the outcome would have been more in the Armenians' favor in Karabakh. But clearly, Armenia would still be much more stuck in this Russian alliance.
So you do give some credit there, some props in terms of how they'd be able to maneuver. But basically, that just on the strength of their own maneuvering or their own wiles, they'd be able to keep that relationship going, even with Russia bogged down.
Yeah, I mean, who knows what? I mean, this was going to break down at some point, but I think the scale and catastrophe of the Armenian defeat could have been avoided. It could actually have been avoided by Pashinyan. We know on October the 19th, 2020, Putin basically offered him the same deal, in which Shusha would have been, there would have been a kind of much more of a, Shusha would have been kind of a bit 50-50. There would have been the Russian peacekeepers in there. It would have been a much better deal for the Armenian side, and the Russians would have put pressure on Azerbaijan to accept it. Well, I mean, I think that's, I think the Russians, that's probably what the Russians wanted, and if Pashinyan had accepted, then Russia would have done what it could to pressure Azerbaijan to accept it as well. So I think this completely catastrophic outcome for the Karabakhis, where they lose their homeland, basically, and I don't see any way that they're going to ever go back in large numbers, to be honest, or would have to be a totally different Azerbaijan for that to happen. I think that could have been avoided by various Armenian decisions at various points.
Okay. I wanted to ask you about, this is also a big point of contention on the Armenian side, but how much significance do you give to, I think it was in the Brussels meeting, but May of this year, when Pashinyan had recognized the territorial integrity of Azerbaijan, which included the then still disputed Nagorno-Karabakh Republic. How much significance do you give to that May recognition, or do you think this was already a wrap on the November 9th agreement in 2020?
No, I don't think it was a wrap. I still think it was clearly, Azerbaijan pretty much had all the cards, but I think I don't think it was a wrap. I think clearly what they were trying to do on the European side. So they're basically, okay, if you don't mind a slightly longer answer, there were kind of two outcomes, I think. One was the kind of Russian option, which is that you postpone the status of Karabakh, you keep the Russian peacekeepers there indefinitely, Russia keeps its foothold, you work on all the other issues, and the Karabakh issue gets kicked down the road, and the Russians stay there, which, I think probably looked possibly a viable option up until the Ukraine war, in which then at that point, the Russian mission was degrading, and that no longer looked like an option, and the West certainly didn't want a kind of totally Russian a deal where Russia had total control of the outcome, and I don't think the locals would have wanted that either, to be honest. But of course, the locals continued to believe in that to their detriment, and then you had the Ruben Vardanyan coming in, and I think also spoiling things and making them believe in things they shouldn't have believed in. Anyway, so then the other option was the EU option, whereby Armenia recognizes territorial integrity of Azerbaijan, and then you talk about rights and guarantees of the Karabakhis, maybe some small, very modest international mission as a kind of confidence building presence on the ground for them. But then two things needed to happen for that. One was Aliyev needed to reciprocate after Pashinyan had made that big speech. Aliyev needed to reciprocate and say, yeah, we've turned the page now, this is historically significant, and let's talk. And the other thing was that the Karabakh Armenians needed to play along. But as I said, they were still in denial, and they were really very much in denial right up until this summer, and one can say, obviously, there was isolated afraid people. But they they really needed to also to send the right signals, and they weren't doing that. And for whatever reason, the leadership, Vardanyan, whatever, or the Russians or the diaspora, whoever was feeding the messages, they really didn't get the message that they needed to change their language as well. And that was obviously a big contributory factor. And just to end this rather long answer, I think the real tragedy for me is that I gather in the last few weeks, they had got it. They were talking to Baku, they were meeting in Shusha secretly. I'm told the new leader, Shah Rahmanyan, had met senior Azeri officials in Shusha. A process had finally started. All you needed was time, and they would have accepted a deal which, would have been.
Sorry, I 1 second. Your audio went out. Can you guys hear him? Okay, here we're back.
Okay, sorry. This answer is a bit long, but basically a process had started, and that's, for me, is the tragedy that clearly someone in Baku, President Aliyev, decided, no, we're going to go ahead and we're going to have the military operation anyway, and basically we're going to drive them out. Drive them out in the sense that we just send in the army. There's mass casualties, and the population gets the message.
You mentioned Ruben Vardanyan. What happened with that whole fiasco? I mean, do you think that was just Russia double crossing him, or are they just impotent where they couldn't even bring him back? I mean, you mentioned that he wasn't sending the right message, but was he doing that on behalf of Russia?
I really don't know. I think some people were absolutely sure he was sent in by Russia. I'm not so sure. I think he probably had his own agenda. He was probably coordinating with the Russians, but clearly clearly he raised expectations. He raised hopes. There's a constant theme of Armenians in Karabakh is that they fight too long because they believe someone's going to come in at the last moment on their side and rescue them or join the battle. Someone from Europe, some civilization, from Russia, obviously. And I'm afraid this was the same story with Vardanyan. That whatever he was up to, and I'm not quite sure what he was up to, it certainly muddied the waters. It complicated the picture, and it made the war more likely.
I apologize. I've plugged in my phone so it doesn't die. Thank you for answering that. The Vardanyan thing, is one that's unfortunate because of how recently he came there, and we, as you mentioned, we don't know exactly what was happening, but definitely it's a shame to see him booked like that. My next question is, why is Azerbaijan still mad at you?
Lots of people are mad at me.
I'm of course specifically referring to your recent thread. I found that interesting because you're someone who's probably used to criticism from either side, and you actually addressed this one, and it seemed rather urgent. I was curious if you could shed some light on it.
Oops, can't hear you properly.
So I was saying, I'm referring to your recent thread that you posted in regards to some allegations. I was hoping you could shed some light on it.
Oh, okay. Well, for goodness knows, that's a kind of separate story about the fact that Andrew Carnegie, there are lots of Andrew Carnegie organizations around the world, and one of them was, the president was the much beloved, actually, and respected Maratom Grigoryan, but Azerbaijan, amazing guy who did, if you look at his biography and all he did in America and the books he's written. But as all Azerbaijanis see is two things: one, his surname ending in Yan, and two, that he collaborated with Vardanyan on this Aurora Prize, and then the conspiracy mongers get into action. Okay, Grigoryan Maratom Grigoryan equals Carnegie Corporation equals Carnegie Endowment, Carnegie Endowment equals Tom de Waal, blah, blah, blah. That's just, I'm afraid just an incredibly low level, I have to say,
Right.
this primitive level of the way some Azerbaijani propaganda and media works. It's a bit better in Armenia, but in Azerbaijan it's almost as bad in Armenia, but that's pretty bad. I mean, why Azerbaijan is mad at me? Because I've been calling them out. I mean, what would they expect me to, when I've been calling for peace and human rights and people and to stay in their homes and protection of minorities all these years, and I see a Azerbaijani military operation that basically drives all the Karabakhis out. What am I supposed to do but say that this is appalling, that I condemn it? That's the way I am. And if I lose people to talk to in Azerbaijan, so be it.
All right. And Javid in the comments wants to be recognized for
yes, he was the first one who first alerted me about this. And I
shout out to Javid.
Had a discussion about do I react or not, and then so many people contacted me, and I thought, no comment is not good enough, so I had to react.
Give me a silver lining in Armenian and Azerbaijani relations, or the formerly populated with Armenians areas of Nagorno-Karabakh. But give me a silver lining for this whole situation, if there is one, or what your forecasting looks like.
I don't see many silver linings, to be honest, I'm afraid. Clearly it's a big tragedy, I think, that it ended this way. People are saying it was inevitable, but I think there was still a chance to avoid it. I don't believe Karabakh are going to go home. As I said, I think Azerbaijan has to be a totally different place, where the way it treats its citizens, its minorities. It has to stop this kind of anti-Armenian propaganda in schools and the media before any Armenian will feel, of course, that they want to get Azerbaijani citizenship and live there again. Maybe a few hundred or even a few thousand people, but not a substantial population.
It could be zero. It probably is going to be zero right now, but for the
well,
time
it
being,
could be a few hundred, but so I don't see any silver lining there. I don't see any silver lining in Azerbaijan, which I see continuing on its authoritarian path and denying rights to most of its citizens. Armenia's incredibly vulnerable. Armenia's, I think, changing and becoming more Europeanized, looking west. But will it have a chance to fulfill that destiny is obviously a big question when given what its neighbours are still up to. Obviously, we hope for the best. I think that would be the good outcome if we can see a kind of democratic post-Russia Armenia emerging out of this. But really, to do that, you need Azerbaijan and Turkey to play along. You need Azerbaijan and Turkey to say that that's the Armenia they're happy to see, and they unfortunately don't seem to be happy to see that. If there's a silver lining, I guess it's people like you. It's this younger generation who are fed up, who want to break this cycle of hatred, want to think for themselves, want to kind of look at alternative futures. And all credit to you for Bright Garden Voices, and there's obviously other initiatives out there. But you're clearly, obviously, still a minority, unfortunately.
Well, the credit goes to like Arnold and Diego and Rauf. I'm just a guy who's not Armenian, not Azerbaijani. They created it. So are there any books or projects that you're currently working on, or that we could expect to see from you in the future? People keep on asking me whether I would ever update Black Garden, and the answer is no. I think it stands as a text, and maybe it's now a text that's going out of date, but no, I'm not going to go there again. To be honest, I think we all suffer from trauma of different kinds related to this conflict. Obviously, lots of people direct trauma. They've lost loved ones, they've lost homes. But I think there's an outer circle of people who are suffering from what I would call secondary trauma from this conflict. People who
his friends that have gone through something, or people like me, and I put myself in that category. I think I suffer from secondary trauma on this conflict. It's very painful for me to see the way it carries on. So I'm not going to touch that again. If I did another Caucasus book, I'd like to do it on culture, on a kind of culture. It's kind of my theme in my work is about how the South Caucasus is more than the three big nations in it. It's got Georgians, Armenians, Azerbaijan. It's got a common culture, and there are people who've bridged across that culture. So it would be a book about the kind of Caucasus culture which is cross-border. It would be a bit about jazz. It would be about Sayat Nova, Sergei Parajanov. Some of these musicians who still work together. So it would be a bit of a kind of alternative take on the region, trying to kind of, and it would be a bit about culture, because I think culture is where people have broken down the silos in this region most effectively.
That actually sounds pretty great. That would be something I'd personally be very much interested in, as someone proud of a Pan-Caucasus identity. Awesome. That was all my questions. I forgot to mention this earlier, but I was going to open, if anyone had questions throughout the chat or throughout the talk, just send it to me and I'd ask. No one sent anything. If you guys had anything, you guys can ask now, I suppose. Otherwise, we can wrap this up, as it is 2:27 a.m. here on the West Coast.
Okay, yeah, you need some rest.
Yeah, okay. Doesn't look, I don't see anyone putting anything in, so I apologize if I don't get to you. But once again, thank you, Thomas.
Yeah, it's been a real pleasure. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you, and you guys all have a great rest of your night or day.